A young bride enters a world of wealth and mystery only to discover the man she married is hiding a dark secret behind a locked door. What she uncovers will change her life forever. Aisha grew up in a small, vibrant village where life was simple, yet her dreams were vast. Her family's modest home was filled with love, but it was also a place of struggles. Her father, once a strong and hardworking man, had fallen ill, leaving Aisha and her mother to shoulder the responsibilities of the household. Despite the challenges, Aisha carried a quiet hope in her heart, a hope for a life filled with love, companionship, and purpose. She spent her days tending to her younger siblings and helping her mother in their small kitchen, where the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Yet her evenings were her own, a time she cherished. Sitting by the window of her room, she would lose herself in the pages of romantic tales, stories of love and destiny that gave her solace and a glimmer of belief that her life could one day be different. Her beauty was subtle yet striking, a reflection of her inner grace. Aisha's kind demeanor and unwavering sense of duty had made her beloved in her community. People often remarked that she deserved a life beyond the confines of her village, a sentiment she secretly held close to her heart. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of Dubai, Khalid was a man whose name commanded respect and admiration. He was the epitome of success, a self-made millionaire who had built an empire from nothing. His days were filled with high-stakes deals and luxurious parties, a life envied by many. Yet, behind the grandeur, Khalid was a man of few words, his silence often mistaken for arrogance. Those close to him knew that his charm was a mask, concealing a past he refused to discuss. Khalid's mansion stood as a testament to his wealth. Marble floors, towering chandeliers, and walls adorned with artwork from across the globe. But within those walls, there was an emptiness that even the finest luxuries couldn't fill. He would often find himself standing alone in his vast living room, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights. In those quiet moments, he would clutch an old photograph, his gaze lingering on it with a mixture of longing and regret. For Khalid, relationships were fleeting and superficial. He was courteous and polite, but there was a guardedness in his demeanor that kept people at arm's length. Many women were drawn to his wealth and status, but none had ever managed to breach the emotional walls he had built around himself. Khalid often wondered if anyone ever could. Unbeknownst to both Aisha and Khalid, their worlds were on the brink of collision. A simple girl from a humble village and a wealthy man, burdened by his own secrets, were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. The morning of the wedding was nothing short of a dream, a spectacle that seemed to have been pulled straight out of a fairy tale. The sprawling venue, nestled in the heart of Dubai, was adorned with intricate floral arrangements, cascading lights, and golden drapes that shimmered in the sunlight. Guests arrived in sleek black cars, dressed in their finest attire, each one eager to witness the union of Khalid, the enigmatic millionaire, and Aisha, the simple yet captivating bride. Aisha stood in the bridal suite, her reflection staring back at her from a gilded mirror. Her ivory gown, adorned with delicate beadwork and lace, fit her perfectly, but there was a nervous energy about her. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her veil, the weight of the day sinking in. She had never imagined her life would lead to a moment like this, surrounded by opulence that felt so foreign yet alluring. As she descended the grand staircase, escorted by her father, all eyes turned to her. There was a collective gasp among the guests, their murmurs filled with admiration. Aisha's beauty was radiant, but her gaze was uncertain. The grandeur around her felt overwhelming, and as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Khalid stood at the altar, his presence commanding and confident. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his sharp features softened as his eyes met Aisha's. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, there was an intensity in his gaze that Aisha couldn't quite decipher. He extended his hand to her, his grip firm, almost too firm, as if to assert control over the moment. The ceremony was grand, every detail meticulously planned. As the imam recited the vows, Aisha felt a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, apprehension, and a quiet sense of surrender. Khalid, on the other hand, maintained his composure, but there were subtle moments that hinted at something deeper. His tone, though calm, carried an undertone of authority when he addressed Aisha, and his instructions to the staff were sharp, almost curt. During the reception, the guests marveled at the lavish feast and the glittering chandeliers that illuminated the hall. Khalid moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries and charming his way through conversations. Aisha, however, found herself often standing alone, her soft smile masking the unease that was growing within her. It was during a quiet moment that Khalid approached her. Placing his hand on her arm, he leaned in and whispered, "You should stay by my side. It doesn't look good for you to wander off." His tone was gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. Aisha nodded, her voice caught in her throat, and followed him back into the crowd. The evening ended with a spectacular display of fireworks, their colors lighting up the night sky. The guests applauded, their faces filled with joy and admiration. But as Aisha stood beside Khalid, watching the sky light up in vibrant hues, she couldn't help but feel a faint chill. The celebration was grand, but beneath the surface there was a tension she couldn't ignore, a hint of something that made her question what lay ahead. As the grand wedding came to an end, Khalid escorted Aisha to their car, a sleek black limousine waiting to take them to their new home. The drive was quiet, the city lights flashing by as Aisha sat beside Khalid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stole glances at him, trying to read his stoic expression, but he seemed lost in thought. Her own heart was a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, nervousness, and a growing sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. When they arrived at the mansion, Isha's breath caught in her throat. It was a sprawling estate, its high gates opening to reveal a long driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and fountains that sparkled under the moonlight. The mansion itself was a marvel of architecture, with tall columns, intricate carvings, and grand windows that glowed warmly from within. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a world so far removed from the modest home she had grown up in. Khalid led her inside, his steps confident as if he belonged to the very foundation of the place. Aisha followed hesitantly, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The grand foyer opened up into a massive hall adorned with opulent chandeliers, expensive artwork, and furniture that seemed more suited for a museum than a home. Her eyes darted around, taking in the sheer scale of it all. It was breathtaking, yet strangely intimidating. "This is your home now," Khalid said, his voice calm but with an edge of formality. He gestured toward a staircase that spiraled upward, its banisters gleaming under the soft glow of the lights. "Take your time to get familiar with it. I'll have the staff show you around tomorrow." Aisha nodded, her voice caught in her throat. As he left to attend to some work in his study, she wandered through the hall, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The staff, dressed impeccably, moved quietly around her, their expressions neutral, almost mechanical. She offered them polite smiles, but their responses were curt, their gazes avoiding hers. The silence of the mansion was deafening. Every room she entered felt enormous, as though it could swallow her whole. The grandeur, while stunning, felt cold and distant, lacking the warmth of a home. Even her bedroom, with its plush carpets, intricate drapes, and a bed that looked like it belonged to royalty, felt alien. She ran her fingers along the ornate furniture, trying to anchor herself to this new reality, but it only deepened the sense of isolation. As the evening wore on, Aisha sat by the large window in her room, staring out at the vast gardens illuminated by soft lights. The view was beautiful, but her thoughts were heavy. She missed the laughter of her siblings, the comforting chatter of her parents, and the simplicity of her old life. This place, though magnificent, felt like a gilded cage. Khalid returned later that night, his demeanor unchanged. "Are you settling in?" he asked, standing by the doorway, his gaze unreadable. "Yes," Aisha replied softly, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful." He nodded, stepping closer. "Good, you'll get used to it soon." His tone was firm, almost dismissive, as if her discomfort was a fleeting inconvenience. He leaned down to kiss her forehead before retreating to his own room, leaving her alone once more. As Aisha lay in the enormous bed, staring at the high ceiling, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The mansion, for all its beauty, seemed to hide secrets within its walls, and Khalid's detached demeanor only deepened her anxiety. Though she tried to push the thoughts aside, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that her new life was not as perfect as it appeared. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the mansion, casting a golden glow on the intricate patterns of the marble floors. Aisha woke early, still adjusting to her new surroundings. The silence of the house was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sounds of the staff attending to their duties. Determined to familiarize herself with her new home, she decided to explore the mansion. Wandering through the grand hallways, she marveled at the sheer scale and luxury of the estate. Each room she entered seemed more opulent than the last. Lavish sitting rooms with gilded furniture, a library filled with leather-bound books, and a dining hall large enough to host dozens of guests. Yet the magnificence did little to ease her unease. The house felt more like a museum than a home, its vastness a constant reminder of how out of place she felt. As she descended a smaller staircase toward the lower levels of the mansion, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The polished floors gave way to darker, less ornate corridors. The light was dimmer here, and the air carried a faint chill. Her steps slowed as she came across a heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. It stood out, its iron handle and bolts a stark contrast to the elegance of the rest of the house. Curiosity tugged at her. She reached out and touched the cold surface of the door, her fingers brushing against its rough texture. It was locked. Leaning in, she noticed faint scratches around the edges, as if someone had tried to force it open. A soft shiver ran down her spine. What could be behind this door in a house filled with so much grandeur? Why was this part of the mansion so different? Just as she was about to step back, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Khalid's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Aisha, what are you doing here?" She turned quickly, startled by his tone. Khalid stood a few steps away, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with a stern expression, his jaw clenched tightly. I was just exploring," Aisha stammered, her voice faltering. "I didn't mean to." "This area is off limits," Khalid interrupted, his voice cold. He stepped closer, his tall frame towering over her. "You have no reason to be here. I've told the staff not to let anyone near this door." Aisha blinked, confused by his sudden anger. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I was just curious. What's behind the door?" "That's none of your concern," Khalid replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. His eyes darkened as he looked at the door, then back at her. "There are parts of this house that are private. You need to respect that." His words were firm, almost threatening, and Aisha felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, lowering her gaze. "I understand. I won't come here again." Khalid's expression softened slightly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "Good," he said after a pause. "If you need anything, ask the staff. There's no need for you to wander aimlessly." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Aisha standing alone in the dim corridor. She glanced back at the door, her curiosity now mingled with unease. Khalid's reaction had been more intense than she expected, and his refusal to explain only deepened the mystery. As she made her way back upstairs, her mind raced with questions. What was Khalid hiding? Why was he so adamant about keeping her away from the basement? The locked door now seemed to symbolize everything she didn't understand about her new life, a barrier not just to a room, but to the truth about the man she had married. Days passed, but Aisha couldn't shake the image of the locked door from her mind. The coldness in Khalid's voice, the sharpness of his warning, it all lingered like a shadow in the corners of her thoughts. The mansion, with all its splendor, began to feel suffocating. The grandeur only served to remind her of the secrets it held, secrets she was now determined to uncover. She began to observe the house staff more closely, noticing things she hadn't before. Their movements were precise, almost robotic, and they rarely spoke unless spoken to. They avoided eye contact with her, their polite smiles never reaching their eyes. It was as if they were all bound by some unspoken rule, one she hadn't been privy to. One morning, while passing through the hallway near the kitchen, she overheard two maids whispering. Their words were muffled, but their tone carried a sense of urgency. As soon as they noticed her, they abruptly stopped, bowing their heads and scattering in different directions. Aisha's heart raced. What were they hiding? And why did they seem so wary of her presence? Her curiosity grew stronger with each passing day. She began to test the boundaries of her freedom within the mansion, venturing into areas she hadn't explored before. She lingered near the basement corridor more frequently, pretending to admire the artwork on the walls or adjust her shawl as the staff passed by. Their reactions were telling. Furtive glances, stiffened postures, and hurried steps whenever they neared that part of the house. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion bathed in a warm golden glow, Aisha decided to push her curiosity a little further. She walked toward the kitchen, where the head housekeeper, an older woman named Fatima, was instructing the staff about the next day's preparations. Fatima was the only one who seemed approachable, her demeanor stern yet maternal. "Fatima," Aisha said softly, stepping into the room. The older woman turned, her expression neutral but not unkind. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am," Fatima replied, her hands folded in front of her. "I've noticed a door in the lower corridor," Aisha began, trying to sound casual. "The one with the iron bolts. What is it for?" Fatima's face betrayed a flicker of emotion, surprise, followed by a fleeting look of unease. She recovered quickly, her tone steady. "It is an old storage room, ma'am. Nothing of importance." "Storage?" Aisha pressed, her curiosity now burning. "Why is it locked? And why does Khalid seem so particular about it?" Fatima hesitated, her hands fidgeting slightly. "Mr. Khalid has his reasons, ma'am. It is not my place to question or discuss them." Her voice softened, almost pleading. "Please do not concern yourself with it. Some things are best left alone." The words sent a chill down Aisha's spine. Fatima's response, though polite, carried an undertone of warning. She nodded, offering a forced smile, and excused herself, but her mind was now racing more than ever. That night, as Aisha lay in her grand bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, the pieces began to fall into place. The strange behavior of the staff, Khalid's sudden bursts of anger, the locked door, it all pointed to something hidden, something dark. Aisha felt a knot tighten in her chest. She knew that if she wanted to uncover the truth, she would have to tread carefully. But the more she tried to suppress her curiosity, the stronger it grew. The mansion's walls seemed to whisper to her, urging her to dig deeper, no matter the cost. One quiet evening, as the household settled into its usual rhythm, Aisha found herself drawn once again to the lower corridor. The faint hum of the mansion's activity upstairs barely reached this part of the house, leaving the air heavy with silence. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing against the cold marble floor, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As she neared the locked door, something unusual caught her attention. A faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, seemed to emanate from behind it. She froze, her breath hitching. Straining her ears, she realized it wasn't just tapping. There were muffled noises, indistinct but unmistakably present. Someone or something was behind that door. Aisha's mind raced with possibilities. Was it a storage room, as Fatima had claimed? Or was Khalid hiding something far more sinister? The thought made her blood run cold. She leaned closer, her hand hovering over the iron handle, but the door remained as immovable as ever. The sounds continued, faint yet persistent, as if calling to her. Before she could think further, the creak of a floorboard behind her made her whirl around. One of the maids stood at the far end of the corridor, her face pale. "Ma'am," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't be here." The maid's words jolted Aisha back to reality. Nodding quickly, she stepped away from the door, her heart racing as she returned to the main part of the house. But the faint sounds haunted her, their echo lingering in her mind like an unanswered question. That night, as Khalid returned from his study, Aisha decided she could no longer keep her thoughts to herself. She needed answers. She found him in the grand living room, seated in an armchair, reading a document. The golden light of the chandelier above cast long shadows across his sharp features, making him look both regal and unapproachable. "Khalid," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. He looked up, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, Aisha? Is something troubling you?" She hesitated, but the memory of the faint sounds pushed her forward. I went near the basement again today," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Khalid's expression darkened immediately. He placed the document on the side table and leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "That area is off limits." "I know, but I heard something," Aisha continued, her tone pleading. "There were noises coming from behind the door. What's in there, Khalid? Why won't you tell me?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might lash out, but instead he stood and turned away, his back to her. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with," he said, his voice colder now. "This is my house, Aisha, and there are parts of it that are private. You need to respect that." "But Khalid," she pressed, stepping closer, "if it's nothing, why are you so secretive about it? Why does everyone seem so afraid of that door?" He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "Enough," he said sharply, his tone final. "You are my wife, Aisha, not my interrogator. I expect you to trust me and stay away from things that don't concern you." The words stung, but what hurt more was the impenetrable wall he had placed between them. Aisha lowered her gaze, nodding slightly, though her mind was anything but settled. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her in her tracks. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "For your own sake, Aisha, let it go." As she walked away, tears pricked her eyes, but her resolve only grew stronger. Khalid's cryptic responses and the fear in his voice weren't enough to deter her. They only confirmed that there was more to this than he was willing to reveal. She knew now that she couldn't let it go, no matter how much he warned her. Something was hidden behind that door, and she was determined to find out what. The tension between Aisha and Khalid reached its breaking point the next evening. The atmosphere in the mansion was heavy, an unspoken unease hanging in the air. Aisha had spent the day replaying their previous conversation, her frustration and fear growing with every passing moment. Khalid's evasiveness, the strange behavior of the staff, and the haunting sounds behind the locked door had become too much to bear. As Khalid returned to the grand dining room for dinner, Aisha was already seated, her demeanor unusually quiet. She waited until the staff had finished serving and left the room before speaking. "Khalid, we need to talk," she said firmly, her voice breaking the silence. Khalid glanced up from his plate, his brow furrowing. "What is it, Aisha?" She took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine. There's something wrong in this house, and you know it." He leaned back in his chair, his expression growing colder. "I don't understand what you mean." "You do," she shot back, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "The locked door in the basement, the noises I heard, the way the staff acts as if they're terrified of something. You're hiding something, Khalid, and I have a right to know what it is." Khalid's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I told you to stay away from that door. This is not a conversation I'm willing to have." "But why?" Aisha demanded, standing now, her voice rising. "Why can't you tell me the truth? You've brought me into this house, into your life, but you keep me in the dark about everything that matters. Is this what marriage is supposed to be?" Khalid stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Enough, Aisha," he said, his voice low and filled with restrained fury. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then make me understand," she cried, tears brimming in her eyes. "What are you so afraid of? What are you hiding from me?" His expression hardened, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. A flash of vulnerability, quickly masked by anger. "This isn't about fear," he said quietly, but his tone carried an edge of warning. It's about protecting you." "Protecting me?" Aisha repeated, disbelief etched on her face. "From what, Khalid? From the truth?" He took a step toward her, towering over her as his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "From yourself, Aisha. You don't know what you're dealing with, and it's better that way." Before she could respond, he turned sharply and strode out of the room. Aisha followed him, her emotions boiling over. "You can't keep doing this," she yelled, her voice echoing through the halls. "You can't keep shutting me out." Khalid stopped abruptly near the staircase to the basement and turned to face her, his expression now unreadable. "If you won't listen to me willingly, then I'll make sure you do." Before Aisha could comprehend his words, Khalid opened the door to the basement and gestured for her to step inside. "Go," he said, his tone cold and commanding. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking as fear gripped her. "For your safety," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll stay here until you learn to respect my boundaries." Aisha stared at him in disbelief, but his expression was unyielding. Realizing she had no choice, she stepped into the dimly lit space. The air was cold and damp, the faint scent of must lingering. As soon as she was inside, Khalid closed the door behind her with a loud thud, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the confined space. "Khalid!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "You can't do this! Let me out!" But there was no response. The silence outside was deafening, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the growing darkness around her. As she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face, Aisha felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and fear. What had she gotten herself into? And why did Khalid believe locking her away was the answer? The faint sounds she had heard earlier returned, this time louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from somewhere deeper within the basement. Her fear intensified, but so did her determination. Whatever Khalid was hiding, she was now closer to uncovering it than ever before. The dim light bulb flickered weakly in the basement, casting long shadows on the cold, bare walls. Aisha sat on the dusty floor, her back against the locked door, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, had locked her away like a prisoner. Tears welled up in her eyes as she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The coldness of the room seeped into her skin, amplifying the chill in her heart. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, but her mind betrayed her, pulling her back into memories she had tried to cling to for comfort. In her mind, she saw the day she first met Khalid. His charming smile, the way his eyes had sparkled with a warmth that felt genuine. He had swept her off her feet with his kindness, his attention, and the way he made her feel like the most important person in the world. She remembered the small, thoughtful gestures, the flowers he brought her, the gentle way he would take her hand, the promises he made about building a life together. But now, those memories felt like a cruel joke, a facade that had shattered into 1,000 pieces. How could the man who had once whispered words of love and devotion now be the same one who had locked her away in this dark, suffocating place? The betrayal cut deep, her trust crumbling under the weight of his actions. Aisha wiped her tears and stood, the cold floor beneath her feet grounding her. She began to pace, her mind racing with a whirlwind of thoughts. She looked around the room, searching for anything that could help her. Old furniture was piled in one corner, covered in thick layers of dust, and a broken shelf leaned precariously against the wall. There were no windows, no visible way out. The only sound was her own breathing and the faint hum of distant noises coming from the house above. Her eyes fell on an old chest in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. Desperation drove her to it, and she knelt down, pulling it open. Inside were remnants of the past, faded photographs, torn papers, and a small, rusted box. She sifted through the contents, hoping to find something, anything, that could give her a clue about what was happening. But all she found were fragments of a life she didn't understand, pieces of a puzzle that only raised more questions. As she sat back on her heels, her mind wandered again to Khalid. She thought about the subtle signs she had ignored, the moments when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way he avoided certain topics, the flashes of anger that he quickly masked. She had convinced herself that it was nothing, that every relationship had its challenges. But now, those small moments felt like warnings she had failed to heed. The flickering light above her brought her back to the present. She stood again, this time moving toward the door. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any signs of movement outside. It was silent. She pounded on the door with her fists, her voice breaking as she called out, "Khalid, let me out, please." But there was no response, only the hollow echo of her own voice. Pacing once more, Aisha's mind began to shift from despair to determination. She couldn't allow herself to remain trapped both physically and emotionally. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece together everything she knew. The locked door, the faint sounds, the staff's strange behavior. There was something in this house, something Khalid didn't want her to discover. And whatever it was, she knew it held the key to understanding why he was acting this way. A faint noise broke her train of thought, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from deeper within the basement. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was different this time, closer, more deliberate. It wasn't just the building settling or the echoes she had heard before. Someone or something was here with her. Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to take a step toward the sound. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of a broken chair for support. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, and her breathing grew shallow. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to retreat, but a small voice within her pushed her forward. In that moment, Aisha realized that she wasn't just fighting for answers. She was fighting for herself, for her freedom, and for the truth that Khalid was so desperately trying to keep from her. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't give up now. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets, it was about reclaiming the trust and dignity that had been ripped away from her. As Aisha's pacing slowed, her eyes drifted back to the old chest she had rummaged through earlier. Something about it nagged at her, an instinct pulling her back to inspect it again. She knelt down, her hands trembling slightly as she dug deeper into the dusty contents. Beneath a pile of faded photographs and yellowed papers, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. She paused, her breath catching, and carefully pulled it out. It was an old mobile phone, worn, its casing scratched, but still intact. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned it over in her hands, the faint weight of it a glimmer of hope in the otherwise oppressive darkness. She pressed the power button, praying silently. To her relief, the screen flickered to life, dim and cracked, but functional. The battery icon flashed with a sliver of charge, enough to make one call, perhaps two if she was lucky. Her first instinct was to call Khalid, to demand answers and plead for her release, but she hesitated. He had already shown how far he was willing to go to keep her in the dark. If she called him, she risked alerting him to her discovery and losing her one chance to seek help. Her mind raced with possibilities, the faint sounds from earlier lingering at the back of her thoughts like a warning. Aisha sat down on the cold floor, cradling the phone in her hands as her thoughts shifted to her brother, Ahmed. He had been her confidant growing up, the one person she could always rely on. But she hadn't spoken to him much since her marriage to Khalid. Their last conversation replayed in her mind, his voice tinged with caution, urging her to think carefully before accepting Khalid's proposal. "You don't know him like you think you do," he had said. At the time, she had dismissed it as protective older brother talk. Now, his words felt hauntingly prophetic. She scrolled through the phone's contacts, her fingers shaking as she found Ahmed's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button, doubt creeping in. What if he didn't answer? What if the signal didn't reach from this part of the mansion? What if Khalid discovered the call and things escalated further? But her fear of staying trapped in the unknown outweighed the risks. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. The line rang, each tone stretching into eternity. She glanced nervously at the basement door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Finally, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Aisha, is that you?" Ahmed's voice was filled with surprise and worry. "Yes, it's me," she whispered, her voice shaky but resolute. "Ahmed, I need your help." "What's going on? Are you okay?" he asked, his tone growing more urgent. "No, I'm not," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "Khalid, he's locked me in the basement. There's something wrong, Ahmed. Something he's hiding. I don't know what to do." The line went silent for a moment before Ahmed spoke again, his voice firm and reassuring. "Stay calm, Aisha. I'll come to you. Just tell me where exactly you are. I'll figure out the rest." She quickly described the location of the mansion as best as she could, her words rushed but clear. Ahmed listened intently, asking her to repeat certain details to ensure he had it right. "I'll get there as soon as I can," he promised. "Don't lose hope. I won't let anything happen to you." As the call ended, Aisha clutched the phone tightly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a glimmer of hope. But the relief was short-lived. The faint noises she had heard earlier grew louder, echoing from deeper within the basement. She froze, her eyes darting toward the shadows. Whatever was hidden here wasn't just behind the locked door upstairs. It was close, and it was waiting. The phone, though a lifeline, suddenly felt fragile in her grasp. The seconds ticked by like hours as she braced herself for whatever might come next. All she could do now was wait. For her brother, for answers, and for the truth that would soon unravel everything. Aisha sat on the cold basement floor, clutching the old mobile phone tightly. Her heart pounded as she redialed Ahmed's number. desperate for his steady voice to guide her through the growing fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The faint sounds from deeper within the basement seemed to grow louder, adding urgency to her every move. The line rang once, then twice, before Ahmed's familiar voice broke through. Aisha? Are you okay? What's happening now? Relief washed over her at hearing his voice again, and she fought back tears as she began to speak. Ahmed, it's worse than I thought. Khalid locked me in the basement. I don't know why, but he's hiding something he doesn't want me to see. What do you mean he locked you up? Ahmed's voice was sharp, tinged with anger. Why would he do that? Did he hurt you? No, he didn't hurt me, Aisha replied quickly, though her voice trembled. But the way he's acting, it's like he's afraid of me finding out something. There's this locked door in the house, and I've heard noises coming from it, and now I'm hearing sounds down here too. Ahmed's silence on the other end felt heavy. Finally, he spoke, his tone serious. Aisha, listen to me. This isn't normal. Khalid has crossed a line. I'm coming to get you, but you need to stay calm and stay cautious. How long will it take? She asked, glancing nervously around the dim room. I'll leave right now, he assured her. It'll take me an hour, maybe less to get there. Just hold on. Don't let him know you've contacted me. And whatever you do, stay alert. If there's something dangerous in that basement, don't take any risks. Aisha nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. Okay, she whispered. I'll wait. Please hurry. I will, Ahmed promised, his voice steady and determined. I won't let anything happen to you, Aisha. You're not alone in this. As the call ended, Aisha let out a shaky breath, her hands still clutching the phone. Ahmed's words had given her some comfort, but the growing unease in the room made it hard to hold on to that reassurance. She sat quietly, trying to collect her thoughts and steady her nerves. The faint noises from deeper in the basement returned, more pronounced now. They weren't just random creaks or echoes. There was a pattern to them, like deliberate movements. Aisha froze, straining to listen. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat to the farthest corner of the room, but there was nowhere to hide. She reminded herself of Ahmed's words, stay calm, stay cautious. But as the sounds grew louder, each second felt like an eternity. She gripped the phone tighter, silently praying that her brother would arrive before whatever was lurking in the shadows revealed itself. Aisha sat huddled in the corner of the basement, the faint glow of the old phone still illuminating her trembling hands. Her brother's words lingered in her mind, offering a fragile sense of reassurance. But every passing second felt heavier. The oppressive silence of the basement, punctuated only by the faint noises she couldn't place. She wiped her damp palms on her dress, clutching the phone close to her chest as if it were her only lifeline. Suddenly, footsteps echoed above her, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably Khalid's. Her heart lurched, the sound filling her with dread. She scrambled to her feet, glancing around the dimly lit space for a place to hide the phone. Panic set in as the footsteps grew louder, now descending the stairs toward the basement. She barely had a moment to react before she heard the sharp click of the lock turning. The door creaked open, revealing Khalid's imposing figure. His eyes scanned the room, narrowing slightly as they landed on Aisha. He stepped inside, his presence instantly filling the space with an air of authority and suspicion. What are you doing? Khalid asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge that sent chills down her spine. Aisha swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. Nothing, she replied, forcing her voice to sound casual. I was just sitting here, thinking. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if searching for a lie. Then his eyes flicked to her hands, which were clasped tightly in front of her. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. The phone was still there, hidden under her fingers, but its faint glow threatened to betray her. What's that in your hands? Khalid asked sharply, taking a step closer. Aisha's mind raced. She couldn't let him see the phone. If he discovered she had contacted Ahmed, there was no telling how he would react. Summoning every ounce of composure she had, she quickly shifted her hands behind her back, forcing a nervous smile. Nothing, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Just a piece of fabric I found in that old chest over there. I thought it might be interesting. Khalid's eyes narrowed, and he moved closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. Show me, he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Aisha's pulse thundered in her ears as she glanced toward the chest in the corner. "It's nothing important," she said, trying to sound dismissive. "Just some old scraps. Why does it matter?" Khalid's expression darkened, and for a moment she thought he might grab her arm to force her to reveal what she was hiding. But then his gaze shifted to the chest. He stepped past her, crouching down to inspect its contents. Seizing the opportunity, Aisha quickly slipped the phone into the folds of her dress, tucking it into the hidden pocket she had stitched herself months ago. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice. When Khalid turned back to her, holding up a tattered piece of cloth from the chest, her hands were empty and her expression feigned innocence. "This?" Khalid asked, his tone skeptical as he held the fabric up. Aisha nodded quickly. "Yes, that's what I was looking at. It reminded me of something from my childhood." He studied her for a moment longer, his piercing gaze making her feel as though he could see straight through her. Finally, he tossed the fabric back into the chest and straightened up. "You shouldn't be going through things that don't concern you," he said coldly, his tone carrying a warning. "Stay here and reflect on your actions. This behavior isn't acceptable." Without waiting for a response, Khalid turned and walked out, locking the door behind him once more. Aisha let out a shaky breath, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the faint weight of the phone still tucked safely in her pocket. Her quick thinking had saved her, but the encounter had left her shaken. Khalid's suspicion had been palpable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he grew more aggressive in his attempts to control her. She had to act quickly. Ahmed was on his way, and she needed to be ready when the moment came. The basement was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the dim light bulb overhead. Aisha sat in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, the hidden phone a lifeline she clutched onto tightly. Her pulse raced with anticipation and fear, the seconds ticking by agonizingly slow. Ahmed's words echoed in her mind. "I'll come for you. Stay strong." She repeated them to herself like a mantra, trying to steady her nerves. Suddenly, the muffled sound of an engine reached her ears. A car, no, multiple cars, approaching the mansion. Her heart leapt. Could it be Ahmed? She strained to listen, her breath catching as she heard the faint slam of car doors and hurried footsteps. Her brother had come, just as he'd promised. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with fear. Would Khalid let them in? And if he didn't, would Ahmed be able to force his way inside? Above her, the muffled sounds of movement grew louder. Voices, sharp and commanding, filtered down through the walls. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Ahmed wasn't alone. He had brought the authorities with him. Aisha's heart raced with a mix of hope and dread. She prayed that Khalid wouldn't escalate the situation, that he wouldn't do something drastic in his attempt to keep his secrets hidden. The voices grew closer, echoing through the halls above. Aisha rose to her feet, pacing the confined space as she tried to make out what was happening. The faint creak of the front door opening reached her ears, followed by Khalid's unmistakable voice, sharp and defensive. "Who are you, and why are you here?" he demanded, his tone cold and unyielding. "We're here for Aisha," Ahmed's voice replied, firm and unwavering. "Where is she?" Aisha's heart clenched at the sound of her brother's voice, filled with determination and a protective edge she hadn't heard in years. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. This wasn't the time for weakness. She had to be ready. "There's no one here by that name," Khalid said, his tone laced with defiance. "You have no right to be on my property." "We know she's here," another voice, likely one of the authorities, interjected. "Step aside, Mr. Khalid, or we'll be forced to take action." The tension in the air was palpable, even from where Aisha stood. She pressed her ear to the basement door, trying to hear more clearly. Her palms were slick with sweat as she listened for any sign of escalation. Every moment felt like an eternity, her emotions a volatile mix of hope, fear, and desperation. Above, she heard Khalid's voice again, now lower, almost a growl. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." Aisha's breath hitched. She knew Khalid wouldn't give in easily. He was a man used to control, a man who thrived on power. But Ahmed's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, calm but commanding. "You can either let us in, or we'll come in by force. The choice is yours." The house fell into a tense silence. Aisha pressed herself harder against the door, straining to hear Khalid's response. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls above, followed by the telltale clatter of keys. Khalid was stalling, but he knew he had no choice. Aisha's chest tightened as the tension built. She clutched the edge of a broken chair for support, her knuckles white. Any moment now, she thought, they would reach her. And when they did, the truth Khalid had so desperately tried to hide would finally come to light. The sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices filled the mansion, growing louder as they neared the basement. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the cold door, straining to hear what was unfolding above her. Suddenly, the lock clicked, and the door creaked open. A beam of light from the hall poured into the dark, damp basement. Standing in the doorway was Ahmed, his face etched with a mix of relief and fury. Behind him, two uniformed officers loomed, their expressions stern and alert. "Aisha!" Ahmed called out, stepping toward her and enveloping her in a protective hug. "I'm here now. You're safe." Tears spilled from Aisha's eyes as she clung to her brother, the weight of her fear finally lifting. But the moment was short-lived. From the hallway behind them, Khalid's voice boomed, cold and commanding. "What do you think you're doing? This is my house, my wife." Ahmed turned, placing himself between Aisha and Khalid. "Your wife?" He spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You locked her in a basement like a prisoner. What kind of husband does that?" Khalid stepped forward, his expression dark, his jaw clenched tightly. "You don't understand," he said, his tone a dangerous mix of frustration and defensiveness. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then explain it." Aisha's voice cut through the tension like a blade, her tears replaced by anger and resolve. She stepped out from behind Ahmed, her gaze locking onto Khalid. "Tell me why you've been hiding things from me. Tell me why you locked me away instead of trusting me." For a moment, Khalid seemed to falter, his confident facade cracking under the weight of her accusation. He turned his gaze away, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Aisha's voice rose, her anger spilling over. "From what, Khalid? From the truth? From your secrets?" Khalid took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "From me," his voice heavy with something Aisha couldn't quite place. Shame, perhaps, or regret. "You don't know what I've been through, Aisha. You don't know what I'm capable of." A tense silence fell over the room as Khalid began to speak, his voice low and measured, as if pulling the words from the deepest corners of his mind. "I wasn't always this man. The man you married, the man who built this house. I grew up with nothing. My father was a cruel, controlling man who believed power was the only thing that mattered. He ruled our family with fear, and I swore I'd never be like him." He paused, his eyes flickering with memories he'd tried to bury. "But when I lost my first wife," his voice cracked slightly and he looked away. "When she left me, I realized how powerless I really was. I built this life, this wealth, to make sure I would never lose control again. But the fear stayed with me. The fear that if I let someone too close, I'd lose everything." Aisha's heart twisted at his words, but her anger remained. "So you decided to control me instead? To lock me away because you couldn't face your own fears?" Khalid's gaze snapped back to hers, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "I didn't want to hurt you, Aisha. I thought if I kept you safe, if I kept everything under control, I could protect you from the chaos in my life." "That's not protection," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. "That's imprisonment. You took away my freedom, my trust, my dignity. That's not love, Khalid. That's fear." Ahmed stepped forward, his voice cold and cutting. "You can't justify what you did. You don't own her. She's not a part of your wealth to control." Khalid's face fell, the weight of their words crashing down on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. For the first time, the man who had always held all the power looked vulnerable, broken. Aisha stared at him, her anger tempered by a flicker of pity. "If you really cared about me, you'd have trusted me with the truth. Instead, you let your fears consume you, and in the process you destroyed the very thing you were trying to protect." The room was silent, save for the faint sound of Khalid's heavy breathing. He looked at Aisha, his expression a mix of regret and defeat. "I never meant for it to come to this," he said softly. "I only wanted to keep you safe." Aisha shook her head, her voice firm and resolute. It's too late for that, Khalid. You can't fix what's broken by controlling it. Love isn't about control, it's about trust, and you've taken that away from me. With those words, Aisha stepped back, placing herself beside Ahmed. Khalid's shoulders sagged, his head bowing slightly as he realized he had lost the one thing he had tried so desperately to hold on to. The tension in the room was palpable as the authorities stepped forward, their firm voices breaking the heavy silence. Mr. Khalid, you are under arrest for unlawful confinement and suspected abuse, one officer announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Another officer moved to place cuffs on Khalid, who stood motionless, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped under the weight of his defeat. Khalid didn't resist as the cuffs clicked into place, the sound echoing ominously in the grand mansion. His once commanding presence had all but vanished, replaced by a hollow expression that spoke of regret and resignation. The staff, who had gathered in the shadows, watched in silence, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. As Khalid was led toward the door, Aisha stepped forward, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew she couldn't let him leave without confronting him one last time. Her voice was steady, though laced with pain, as she called out, "Khalid." He stopped and turned, his eyes meeting hers. The fire that once burned in his gaze was gone, replaced by a dull emptiness. Aisha took a deep breath, her emotions swirling, a mixture of anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of closure. "You said you wanted to protect me," she began, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "But all you did was hurt me. You took away my freedom, my trust, and everything that made me feel safe. Do you even understand what you've done?" Khalid's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence more telling than any words he could muster. Aisha stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. "I loved the man I thought you were, the man who promised me a life of happiness and companionship. But that man doesn't exist, does he? You've let your fear and your past turn you into someone I can't recognize." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, her words fueled by the heartbreak she had endured. "You think control can replace trust, that fear can replace love, but it can't. All it does is destroy everything it touches. And now you've lost me, not because of anyone else, but because of your own choices." Khalid's lips parted as if he wanted to respond, but no words came. His eyes glistened, betraying a rare vulnerability, but Aisha couldn't allow herself to waver. This was her moment to reclaim her strength, her dignity, and her life. "I hope one day you can face your fears," she said softly, her tone now more resolute than angry. "Not for me, but for yourself. Because until you do, you'll always be trapped in this cycle, hurting the people you claim to love." The officers gave a slight tug on Khalid's arm, urging him forward, but he lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on Aisha. Finally, he nodded, the faintest gesture of acknowledgement, before turning away and allowing himself to be led out of the mansion. As the heavy front door closed behind him, Aisha felt a weight lift from her chest. Her heart still ached, but for the first time, she could breathe freely. Ahmed placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, offering silent support as she stood in the now empty room. She turned to face her brother, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, she knew it was just the beginning, the start of a journey to rebuild her life, one free from fear and control. As she looked around the grand, empty mansion, Aisha felt a surge of determination. She had lost much, but she had found something far more valuable: her strength, her voice, and the courage to move forward. As the first rays of morning sunlight broke over the horizon, Aisha stepped out of the grand mansion for the last time. The cold air of the night was fading, replaced by a gentle warmth that touched her skin and seemed to seep into her very soul. She paused at the top of the marble steps, taking in the sprawling gardens and the golden light that bathed the estate. The world outside, so vibrant and full of life, felt like a stark contrast to the darkness she had endured within those walls. Ahmed stood by the car at the end of the driveway, waiting for her. His face, though lined with worry, softened into a smile as their eyes met. Aisha felt her breath hitch. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was no longer alone. She descended the steps slowly, her footsteps deliberate, as if each one marked a step closer to freedom. The weight she had carried for so long, The fear, the uncertainty, the heartbreak began to lift with every step she took. By the time she reached her brother, tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing she was finally free. Ahmed opened his arms and she fell into them, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised you I'd come, and I always will." Aisha clung to him tightly, letting the tears flow. She didn't need to speak. Ahmed understood everything she couldn't put into words. His steady presence, his unwavering support was the anchor she had so desperately needed. As they pulled away, Ahmed gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Come on," he said with a soft smile, gesturing toward the car. "Let's get you out of here." Aisha turned to look back at the mansion one last time. The towering structure, once a symbol of wealth and power, now seemed hollow and lifeless. It no longer held any sway over her. She took a deep breath, allowing the sunlight to warm her face, and let the image of the mansion fade from her mind. This chapter was over. She climbed into the car, and as they drove away, Aisha felt a profound sense of clarity. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to forge. With her brother by her side and the promise of a fresh start, she knew she had the strength to rebuild her life. The sunlight streamed through the car windows, illuminating her face as she gazed out at the open road. For the first time in months, Aisha allowed herself to smile, a real unguarded smile. She was no longer trapped, no longer bound by fear or control. She was free.